Hey everybody, today we have two 24mm lenses in front of us. This here is the Canon L Series 1.4 and this is the Rokinon Cinema lens 24mm. Now the difference is of course that one is a more or less a photography lens, prime lens, while the other one is a prime cinema lens. For those of you that don't really know, well, one of the biggest giveaways is the fact that you will see these sort of ribbed external rings. One is for focusing and the other one is for your aperture or your iris, which is the, the blades that open and close to let in light. It's completely declipped, which means that from one aperture setting to another, there is no significant interval. Now, if you're like me, you probably wonder why these cinema lenses are measured in t-stops while your typical photography lens is measured in f-stops. Well, the answer is, in summary, that cinema lenses allow you to know the exact transmission T of light that comes in and actually hits your sensor. So this is T1.5 at widest possible setting, all the way to T22. That's the actual physical amount of light that comes into the sensor, right? Well, on your photography lenses, it'll say f1.4, f whatever. F is actually a ratio, it's a ratio that's relative to your diameter of your aperture ring and the focal length of your lens itself. So unfortunately, f1.4 in this case doesn't necessarily mean it's wider or more open or lets in more light than T1.5 on the Rokinon lens. And we're actually going to find out from a test here which one is brighter and which one is more darker in terms of light transmission. The Canon, of course, is an electronic autofocus lens that allows you to autofocus and change all your settings within the camera. However, we are using a Sony A7S II, which means I'm going to have to use an adapter for the Canon, an EF to E mount adapter. What this does is it still allows me to change things like the aperture and the metadata gets saved. However, I cannot use the autofocus, unfortunately, but that's okay because this lens, the cinema lens, is completely manual. The focus is completely manual. Everything is all manual, which is super cool. It's fun to use and it really allows you to open up your creativity and, choose your focus and change things the way you want to change them. So super fun. Anyway, this is not a scientific test by any means. I'm just comparing the two lenses out of curiosity because obviously the Canon costs like 4 times more than the Rokinon. It's more expensive. It should be better, right? Well, we're gonna find out. And in case you're in the budget for, or looking out, shopping for a lens that's relatively affordable, and you're wondering if Rokinon or any Samyang lens is an option for you, then hang in there and we're gonna see what they look like.
To begin the comparison, I went ahead and put the camera on a slider, and we have the Canon here, and I really wanted to see how much distorting or stretching that the 24mm lenses do. Keep in mind, I'm shooting at 100 ISO, and the shutter speed is the same, so nothing's changing there. The only thing that changes is the aperture in order to stay at 0 exposure value. So I go ahead and slide to the left. There's really nothing major going on. Very minimal distortion in my opinion. Now we go ahead and put the Rokinon lens on. Same thing. Pretty decent looking image. You do notice a little bit the fact that her legs are a little bit bigger on the bottom, and that's mostly because they're closer to the camera and at the lower extremity of the lens. Now we move closer. We're at 2 feet focusing distance to her eyes. Everything is manual focus, don't forget. So it's as close as possible. And you're starting to see more of her face getting stretched out to the corners as I move the camera closer to the left. The Rokinon seems to display this a little bit stronger. A little bit more distortion as she passes the center and goes to the right. It's stretching more. Now at this point, I wanted to see which lens lets in more light. And we have the Rokinon wide open at T1.5. Shutter speed is the same and ISO is still at 100. And we're getting a reading of about -2 exposure value. The only light I'm getting in this room is the window light, so all the lights in the house are turned off. Now I move to the Canon, it's f1.4 wide open, and with the same ISO setting and shutter speed, it's reading at -1.3 exposure value, which sort of technically shows that the Canon at wide open lets in a little bit more light than the Rokinon. Here I went ahead and changed the settings so that exposure value would be at 0. The only thing I changed was the ISO. The Rokinon, I had to crank it up to 640 to get to 0 exposure value. Finally, with the Canon lens, I had to crank up the ISO to only 400, so again, I needed a little bit less sensitivity for the sensor to get to about 0 exposure value on the Canon lens. Now, one thing that the Rokinon does a very good job of is focusing manually, By this I mean that, the focus throw of the lens is very long, and it's really easy to adjust the focus at very tiny and accurate intervals. In this case, I will just move it from the trees into her face. Very comfortable and very smooth focus throw. Now with the Canon, it's a little bit different because it relies on autofocus for photography, so the focus throw is still nice and smooth, but it's a shorter distance and you really have to be a lot more careful when you move your hand around the lens. Overall, there weren't any significant differences between the two lenses, at least in terms of color and contrast and so on and sharpness. They're pretty close to one another. The major differences were, the physical design and the way they work, and of course the fact that the Canon seems to let in just a tiny bit more light than the Rokinon when it is wide open. Now let's go ahead and take a look at the distortion of the two cameras. So here we have the Canon. I'm going to slide to the left here and stop. Take a look at that siding and the white trim on the house. Same thing with the Rokinon. I stop in exactly the same position and you'll notice that the siding and the trim are different in terms of the amount you see. The Canon seems to capture a slightly wider range than the Rokinon. You can see more of the tree on the right and more of the, the siding on the left. Also, the distortion itself in terms of the bowing out of the image is different. In order to really show you guys this, it's kind of hard, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch back and forth real quick between the Rokinon and the Canon. So here's a Rokinon, here's a Canon. You can see the Rokinon is pulling more of that image out. Now, all of this can be fixed post-process, but it's still a pretty decent difference. Finally, let's take a quick look at chromatic aberration. We have the Rokinon on top and the Canon on the bottom. And even though the Canon costs significantly more, you're not seeing any less chromatic aberration at all. In fact, I would argue that the Rokinon has a little bit less of it than the Canon in the same exact situation. And this is something I noticed time and time again when comparing these two brands with one another.
So hopefully you enjoyed this video and it gave you a decent picture of the comparison between this cinema lens and the photography prime lens. Now, of course, this is not, like I said, any kind of scientific or standard test. This is actually completely out of pure fun and curiosity from my side. So I hope you enjoyed the video. Let me know what you think in the comments, give me your opinions, and I will hope to see you all in the next video.